This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, where we help take your leadership to the next level. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And joining me across the desk, as always, is
the one and only
the Dr. Richard Blackaby, the one for whom there is no other.
Sit down, Sam. Yeah. You don't need to rise.
Okay. Sorry, I forgot we discussed that. I've already respected you enough, so enough for a lifetime anyway. So we'll leave it at that. Just
let's leave it there, Sam.
Some guy in his 60s now. Well, with all the disrespect out of the way, we like to do this from time to time, and I think it's been quite a few episodes since we've done a leadership book review, or just a book review. And this one's maybe a little bit different, perhaps not what one would think of as a leadership book. We've done some of the classic leadership books in podcast past. But why don't you maybe start, Richard, by telling us why would we talk about this book, what book it is we're talking about, and also why it would come up on a leadership podcast.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are familiar with very influential, popular writer of recent days, Jordan B. Peterson, who wrote a book, 12 Rules for Life, and an Antidote to Chaos. And he's written a sequel book called 12 More Rules for Life and Beyond Order. And of course, if you're familiar with Peterson, he's kind of an enigma in some ways. He grew up in Fairview, Alberta, and I've been in Fairview, Alberta, and it's right at the end of the beaten path in northern Canada. And he ends up as a professor in Harvard and University of Toronto, and he's a brilliant mind. He's a Freudian, a Jungian psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
He's certainly on a search for God. I don't know that I would call him a born-again believer, but very much searching for God, very honestly, openly. And so I don't necessarily agree with everything he says. He's an evolutionist in a way I would not be, but nonetheless, he's written a very influential book. His first book was very, very popular. Sold millions of copies, and his second book follows along that line. And he's somewhat esoteric in places. He's so heady, he's so academic and brainy that you kind of have to read him slowly. But he has some real practical common sense as well. And so what I thought we might do today, Sam, is just look at one of his rules and unpack it. And perhaps in future episodes we might dig back down into another one. But there were several in this one, this book that I liked, and certainly he makes you think. You need to kind of have had some coffee first and be wide awake before you try digging into this. But
certainly,
it's about 400 or so pages, so it's a thick tome each time. But I thought I would just look at one of his rules, and particularly today, just look at Rule 4. And Rule 4, it says this: notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. And of course, he's trying to give just some practical advice. It's interesting because he's so brilliant that as he tries to give practical advice, you have to read him carefully. But if you kind of
you just end up in this place that's just like, whoa, how did we get here?
I haven't used this many brain cells in a while before, but
didn't even know I had that many brain cells to use.
But he says some interesting things, and basically, I think if you kind of boil down this primary point, he's saying that the world is oftentimes impacted greatly, either by people that acted responsibly, they rose up and they took ownership and they acted wisely and they made a positive difference, or the world is impacted by people that have abdicated responsibility and not done what they should have done or what they were paid to do, what people elected them to do. Mm-hmm. And because they haven't done what they should, now people suffer. There's a lack in society. And so, of course, when you, and I don't think any of us has to rack our brains to think of things that, because people just did shoddy workmanship, they haven't done what they should, that others are paying the price now. And so he says several things that are interesting, and he says a couple things actually in this chapter that have made him somewhat notorious. And so let me just read a couple of statements he makes, and then maybe apply that to leadership. And he says, one thing he says is, what is left undone is often risky, difficult, and necessary. Of course, one of the reasons work isn't done is because it's hard. And so people just don't want to pay the sweat equity, pay the price, suffer the pain to get it done. And yet some of those things are important to be done. And so, one of the things he says is just, if you want to make yourself indispensable, he says, then find something that needs to be done, that isn't being done, and address those issues. And I like that approach where, because you can do some things that aren't being done, but it doesn't matter. There's a reason it's not being done, because it doesn't matter. And then there's other things that really would make a difference. And if you can find those things and choose to roll up your sleeves and get it done, even if it's not necessarily your job, you will very quickly make yourself indispensable to your company, to your church, to your society. And so a couple other quotes he says, the way he says it is, if you want to become invaluable in a workplace, in any community, just do the useful things no one else is doing. And that's, I tell you, you can sure tell the difference between people that have that attitude, that wherever they're going. And I literally, sometimes you could see someone just walking through like a Walmart parking lot, and they see a piece of garbage lying on the ground, and they just instinctively pick it up and just dump it in the garbage bin as they're walking in the door. And you think, well, they're just a customer. Like, they're not paid to do that. Why would they bother to do something so trivial? There must be someone whose job it is to keep the garbage from collecting on the Walmart parking lot. But if you have that mentality in something as small as that, it's going to make a difference. And if you work at a company and you see something that's not done, instead of just walking on by and saying, well, that's not my job, or complaining about people that don't ever do a proper job, if you lean your shoulder into that and get it done, after a while, you become the kind of person that everybody wants to have around, because you make a positive difference. And he says, one thing that's interesting, and this is really his controversial thing, he says, it appears that the meaning that most sustains life is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And of course, this, amazingly, this has been like a significant contribution by Peterson. He says that, and he's traveled the world giving hundreds and hundreds of sold-out lectures all around North America and around the world. And I've heard him say that if he wants everything to go absolutely silent, like you could hear a pin drop, just talk about the secret to meaning and fulfillment, even joy in life, is being responsible, taking responsibility. And of course, in our society, that's oftentimes we do just the opposite. Instead of taking responsibility for my position in life, we blame people for why I'm in this condition. I don't have any money, but let me blame people for discriminating against me, or my former boss, mistreating me somehow, firing me unjustly, instead of saying, maybe I just need to buckle down and work harder and get more education and do a better job at my next place of employment. And so he says, and again, it doesn't mean, and he will be quick to clarify, to say, it doesn't mean that there can't be all kinds of bad management or racism or all kinds of things that are going on, but that may be beyond your ability to change that in your society. But of course, you do have control over yourself, and you can spend your whole life complaining about how unfair life was, or you can start taking responsibility for what you do have control over and make sure that at least you run that well. And he says, not everybody is responsible for leading dozens of employees, but we all get to be responsible for at least one person, being ourselves.
Yeah.
And how do we do that? So he says people need meaning, but problems also need solving. And so he says it's sort of a dovetails there, because we find meaning in taking on responsibility and making a difference, making a contribution. But he says, fortunately, there's a lot of things that need to be done too. So we can make society better while we're also finding purpose for our own life. He says the ultimate question of man is not who we are, but who we could be. He said that people experience positive emotion in relationship to the pursuit of a valuable goal. So he says, find a goal, find something that's worth doing, and then do it with all your heart. You can't do everything. You can't solve all the world's problems. You can't solve maybe some of the world's biggest problems, but find something that you can do, something that's within your realm of ability, and then take it on. And he says, just one or two other things. He says, but what makes you so sure you do not want something heavy to carry? You positively need to be occupied with something weighty, deep, profound, and difficult. Now, this is a trained clinical psychologist saying every person needs to have some weighty, deep calling, responsibility, task, something that you can really lean into, that something that's not easy. If it was easy, there probably would be other people doing it.
Yeah.
But find something that's difficult, that others have passed by and said it's too hard, but something that would benefit others if it were done. And then lean into that and say, that's something that's worth investing my life in. And I was talking to a very successful business person not too long ago, and they're past retirement age. And so they had a lot of friends saying, hey, you should just be living the easy life at this point. You've got plenty of money. You don't need to make any more. And interestingly, what this guy was doing was he was making as much, maybe more money than he ever had, but he was, at this point in his life, was giving it away, investing it in various ministries and undertakings that he believed in. And so the longer he worked, the more blessing he could be to others. Mm-hmm. And so he said to me, well, this is what everyone's telling me to do, to quit and just golf and relax and travel and just take it easy. But he said, most of his friends that he knew that had done that, he said that a lot of them had died within a year of retirement. He said, as soon as they lost their meaning, their purpose, their reason for living, God didn't put people on the planet just to sit in a hammock and just enjoy the easy life. God gave people a purpose. Of course, even Adam and Eve had the task of caring for a garden. So what's interesting for me is to say, what if every American, every person were going about keeping their eyes open to stuff that could be done, problems that could be solved, things that could be made better, and instead of complaining about those slackers that don't do what they're supposed to do, what if you were to take that on and just make it better? And what would your career look like? What would your life look like? What would your happiness level look like if that's how you invested your life? And I think there's some interesting examples in history of that. I think when you look at Presidents Buchanan and then President Lincoln, who came right after him, a lot of people suggest that Lincoln may have been America's best president. Of course, led it through certainly the most tumultuous, divisive time in its history, addressed probably its worst, most difficult, insidious problem of slavery. But the president right before him, James Buchanan, was much more skilled as a politician. At least his track record suggested that. Much more experienced, much more successful, very respected. And of course, he faced all the same problems because he led right before Lincoln did.
Yeah.
He basically set the table for Lincoln, but he refused to address the problem. In fact, in some ways, he facilitated the problem. And Lincoln had to undo things that Buchanan was doing that just made the problem worse.
Yeah.
And so basically Buchanan abdicated responsibility. He knew full well what the chief problem was facing America, and he just thought, I'm not taking that on. I'm not facing that. And to Lincoln's credit, you can criticize him for maybe how he led in some ways or decisions he made. I mean, you can second guess him if you want to. But one thing you can't say is that he just ducked his head and looked the other way and refused to get involved. He waded into the most difficult, devastating problem in American history and took it on, took responsibility for it. Someone had to do that, and he decided that it would be him. And even during during the Civil War, there were some examples even with the Union Army. General McClellan, of course, was celebrated as this brilliant war leader. A nickname, I think, was even Little Napoleon. But the problem was that he was reluctant to fight. He always felt he needed more men, always felt like he didn't have enough supplies. No matter, he was the best supplied army in America, had the biggest army, but always felt it wasn't enough. He needed more. And he refused to do even what the president wanted him to do. And ultimately the president fired him, just said, I need someone just to get the job done, not to keep preparing to get the job done, not someone talking about the problem, but actually fighting, actually taking on the enemy. And so he hired General Ulysses Grant ultimately to take over. And he was a man that probably not as polished, certainly, and educated, as sophisticated in some ways, just like a relentless bulldog, but he knew what the issue was and he tackled it head on. Might have been more sophisticated ways of doing it, but he tackled the problem. And so he became a darling of Lincoln because Lincoln had been looking for years to find someone who would just address the problem. And so in history, sometimes what you find is, of course, if Grant had not been that kind of person, if there had not been people just abdicating responsibility along the way, Grant probably would never have even had his opportunity. And so oftentimes, because someone else has abdicated responsibility, it means that you have the chance now, that you have an opportunity you wouldn't have had otherwise. Now you can shine because you can address things that others haven't done. And so I look at that and just say, there are always those that will sit comfortably in the critic's chair and just criticize what others are doing. But that never actually solves the problem either.
Yeah.
You've got to be someone who says, well, what could I do that would make a difference? And so might just wrap that up after the break.
Sounds like a good idea.
Hello, I'm Richard Blackaby, and I'm president of Blackaby Ministries International. On behalf of my parents and the whole Blackaby team, I want to just thank you for your friendship, your support, your prayers for our ministry. These have been challenging times, and there's been all kinds of difficulties and challenges and hurdles to overcome that churches and individuals and ministries have never had to face before. But I'm reminded of what Paul said in Philippians, where he said, I give thanks to my God for every remembrance of you, always praying with joy for all of you in my every prayer because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And that's certainly my heart as well, to thank you for your partnership with us. And I wanted just to let you know, especially as we come to the end of this year, that a wonderful friend of our ministry just believes so much in what God is doing that he has offered a $100,000 matching gift to our ministry, which means that anyone who gives a donation to our ministry from this point onward through the end of the year, he'll match it up to $100,000. So if you were thinking of giving us $100,000, this is the time to do it because it will be completely doubled by this wonderful donor. But seriously, we just want to encourage you that if the Lord has placed us on your heart, this is a great time to do that. because it will release the matching amount of money. And we just have a conviction here at Blackaby Ministries that God is doing some amazing things right now. Everywhere I go and speak, there just seems to be a hunger and a great response. And so we are looking forward to the year ahead and what God will do. And if you can help in matching this very special gift, it will enable us to be fully prepared to respond to everything God will ask us to do. So thank you for all that you've done, and we look forward to serving with you, partnering with you in the year ahead.
Well, it's no surprise that even before the fall, man and woman were created to work. And there's something, I think, very basic in humanity about work and the value of work and really the fulfillment that brings to an individual. And having the lack of it brings the opposite. And, you sort of, you get rudderless and hopeless, and you can be driven to despair, I think, even. And maybe just in the last few moments we have, what are some other nuggets maybe that you've pulled out of this rule number 4 of Jordan Peterson's?
Let me just read a couple more just odds and end quotes from this chapter, maybe just to spark some of our listeners' own thinking. He says, in my dual role as clinical psychologist and professor, I have coached many people in the development of their careers. Sometimes those I'm coaching consult me because their coworkers, subordinates, or bosses will not do their jobs properly. How many people, that's our greatest frustration, are dealing with people that just won't do their job. They are supervised by, working alongside, or managing people who are narcissistic, incompetent, malevolent, or tyrannical. Such things happen and must be dealt with in whatever reasonable manner will bring them to a halt. I do not encourage people to martyr themselves. He says, but you might then ask yourself, what would happen if I took responsibility for doing them? It is a daunting question. What is left undone is often risky, difficult, and necessary, which you mentioned earlier. And let me just pick up a couple other, I'm going to just read a couple of quotes here. He said, what if you began to build yourself into a person who could? You could start by trying to solve a small problem, something that is bothering you, that you think you could fix. You could start by confronting a dragon of just the size that you are likely to defeat. A tiny serpent might not have the time to hoard a lot of gold, but there might still be some treasure to be won. So, so he had given the illustration of a fierce dragon that's hoarding all the treasure, like in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, the Hobbit.
And to say, you may not try to take on the king of all dragons to begin with. The bigger the dragon, the more the treasure there is. But he says, start off with a smaller dragon. They may not have as much treasure to be won, but at least you get the treasure. Yeah. And you have at least a small win.
And you're building that muscle of responsibility. And, you don't just take on the biggest responsibility right out of the gate. Yeah. Especially if you haven't done much before, starting out. And, just like with exercise, you don't run a marathon first thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it says, by taking responsibility, we can find a meaningful path, improve our personal lot psychologically, and make what is intolerably wrong genuinely better. Thus, we can have our cake and eat it too. And
there's nothing like having a cake and not being able to eat it. I'll say that.
Yeah. He says, people are more commonly upset by what they did not even try to do than by the errors they actively committed while engaging with the world. So he's saying, and I think certainly again as a psychologist, it's interesting because you would think that he would say what really troubles people are the sins they've committed, the things that they feel guilty about. But he says oftentimes what people feel the most guilty about is what they didn't do. And that can mean a lot of things. That could mean people that hated their job but didn't have the courage to quit it and find something else. Yeah. And now years later they're thinking, if I just quit back then and made the leap, I probably could have ended up doing this and loving what I did, but I didn't have the courage. And so he says if you are in this place where you you have this sense of discontent, and maybe you're paying the price for other people's abdication of responsibility. It's better to try to take on something than to just do nothing and complain, and then years later have to wonder what might have been. I know my dad always said that question, what might have been, was the one that he thought might trouble him the most. Of course, he is a guy who went to spectacular heights, but even then you kind of wonder, but where did I lack faith?
Yeah.
Where did I sit back when I should have stepped up? And so he has a number of things. He talks about Peter Pan as someone that just doesn't want to take on responsibility, doesn't want to grow up.
Yeah.
And he has it's interesting, if you've read any of Peterson, he examines various myths and stories and finds the nugget in it that contains a lot of universal wisdom, and basically says, Peter Pan's sort of model, really, in a sense, is Captain Hook, who's also not willing to grow up and take responsibility. And whereas Wendy, the girl, decides to trade in losing her, everlasting youth, basically taking on humanity in the sense of aging. But at the same time, she gets to live real life, like gets to grow up and have a family and experience all the different stages of life.
Well, it's such a sad, just a horribly sad story when you think about it, with Peter Pan, and he gets to see sort of the result of his decision not to grow up in Wendy, and it's just like, man, the life that you forfeit, just to play around and not take on responsibility.
Yeah, Peterson says Wendy, she consciously chooses to sacrifice her childhood for the realities of adulthood, but gains real life in return. Peter remains a child, magical to be sure, but still a child. A life limited, finite, and unique passes him by. And so he always has some interesting insights into some of that. He says, you must sacrifice something of your manifold potential in exchange for something real in life. Aim at something, he says. All the suffering of life with none of the meaning, is there a better description of hell? So he just says everybody needs a purpose. And so, if you want to just sit in your recliner and dream of all these awesome things you could do, in one sense, you perhaps have unlimited possibilities. The moment, it's like if you graduate from university and you think, wow, there's so many things I could do. I could work here, I could work for that company. But at a certain point, you hire on to one company. Now, you've just sort of eliminated a lot of other possibilities. Now you're restricted to working with the possibilities found in one company under one boss. But you also are experiencing reality. And so you sacrifice, he says, some of your potential, but on the other hand, you get to experience real life and you get to flesh it out. And so some people are dreamers and they love to dream of the possibilities. They never get anything done. Yeah. And others say, well, I can't do everything. I at some point, I've got to just get into the game and make a difference somewhere with something. And so he has some interesting things here. I may just catch just one or two other quotes. He says, he says, let us agree to begin with that you have a minimum moral obligation to take care of yourself. So he says, at least start with yourself. At least take that on. If you can't even take care of yourself well, then maybe you're not in a place to take on other responsibility. Yeah. He says, what is a truly reliable source of positive emotions? The answer is that people experience positive emotion in relationship to the pursuit of a valuable goal. And so certainly a question might be for people is, what is the goal that your life is pursuing right now? Yeah. What problem are you addressing? What challenge have you placed upon your shoulders to undertake? And, people sometimes fear hard work or they avoid it like the plague. But the fact is, there's something incredibly meaningful and satisfying about accomplishing a difficult task. And and especially if it's a task that others refuse to do. And so He says, your life becomes meaningful in precise proportion to the depths of the responsibility you are willing to shoulder. That is because you are now genuinely involved in making things better. And he says, and if what you're doing in your day-to-day activity is not enough, then you are not aiming at the construction of a proper cathedral. And that is because you are not aiming high enough. And so he's given the example of people that worked on those ancient cathedrals that might take 2 centuries to build. And so it would never be complete in your lifetime. But, and you might be laying bricks for a certain wall somewhere. And yet you knew that I'm not just building a wall, I'm building a cathedral that will last for the ages. And so he just says, what major undertaking are you pursuing? And certainly there are jobs you can work at that will earn you a living.
Yeah.
It won't necessarily fulfill a calling of purpose and meaning, but they'll pay your bills if that's all your only purpose.
Well, I think that's something that's certainly been lost in our culture today. I mean, from everything from the quality of the houses that are built, a lot of builders today will tell you that they're just not great quality houses, especially when you look at, there's a place called the Landmark Trust in the UK, and it just highlights houses throughout the centuries. And there's houses that are still standing from hundreds of years ago, that were made from brick or stone or what have you, some even of wood. And I think we've lost something as a culture that no longer values those things that are hard won. Building a home that is going to stand the test of time, or investing in a project that is going to outlast you, and rather you sort of give that up for some sort of cheap, momentary copycat of that.
Yeah, and what a shame to spend your life on something that was easy.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 last quotes. It says, there are, after all, things that are crying out to be accomplished. You are outraged that what needs to be done is not being done. That anger, that outrage is, however, a doorway. That observation of abdicated responsibility is the indication of destiny and meaning. So, in terms my dad might have used, whenever you see a problem, that also is an invitation, perhaps a divine invitation to say, I've just shown you an area that you can invest your life, and you could spend your whole life complaining about this, or you could say, maybe the fact that I'm the one who noticed it, I'm the one that it seems to bother. Other people just gleefully walk right on by and don't even pay attention, but I can't do that. I keep noticing it. Well, maybe that's because I'm the one that is supposed to make it better. It bothers me because I'm the one being invited to participate in changing that. And he concludes and says, it is not the call to happiness, it is the call to the action and adventure that make up a real life. So it's a very self-absorbed, basically useless sort of existence, just trying to pathetically look to be happy all the time. And there are just so many people that will do that. They'll do the minimum of work because they just want to be happy. And yet our purpose in many ways is to work. You don't accomplish great feats if you're not willing to work. You don't better yourself without working. You don't solve problems without working. And so perhaps somewhere along the line we've gotten so disoriented to our calling, our purpose, that now we think our purpose is to figure out at the earliest age possible where you don't have to work anymore. And, I would say, and I've kind of looked at my life, I'm not knocking on the door of retirement quite yet, but, my attitude, at least at this point in my life, is I don't necessarily intend to ever retire if I can help it. If I can continue to contribute, I may not work as hard, I may not have the energy, I might need to start taking naps in the afternoon, but as long as I can still get up each day and make the world a little bit better, why would I just sit in my hammock all day?
Yeah.
Why would I have a morning nap and an afternoon nap if I could make the world better somehow?
Yeah, well, just knowing that we're created to work, we're created to take on that responsibility, and and that's one of the ways that brings meaning to a life, and a life well lived is one full of responsibility.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you for taking the time and walking us through this, and I'm sure we'll probably revisit Peterson at some point down the line, but as always, we'll leave links to this book, Beyond Order by Jordan Peterson, and until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.